gathering together, that there is a shared community, shared culture, and a shared currency, which plays a big part to what a government does. Government does that, right? When you have a shared currency to use to transact with each other. So that's already one big component of what makes a government that you can do online. And if you look at things like the metaverse, all these like social networks, people are already like gathering together into these online places or online forums, and they can be from anywhere around the world. And so if you can do that right, then you could imagine these people forming into a country which is online. But then, because let's say you have a lot of capital already, and the members of this country are let's say influential, you could potentially see them like getting a plot of land somewhere on this earth, and then essentially start or found a country together. So it's like you start with a community online, and then you go to a physical place. I want to add one opinion of mine here, because I've thought about this a lot. That if, and this is like, even if you ignore all this crypto stuff, all this network state stuff, right? Like, if you look at people from around the world, let's say whether it's Malaysia or US or UK, you can already see that it's this cultural shift lah. Maybe you want to call it a culture war in certain places, but there's definitely a shift. Because like, imagine if you are a upper middle class person living in KL, right? You speak English, you watch the same TV shows. You would culturally be actually closer to someone, let's say in London or New York, than someone who is in some kampong in Kelantan. And that's the same whether you are here or in the UK or US. So you can already see that there is this big cultural divide already. And what made a country maybe 50 years ago is not as strong, that connection, as it is now. And conversely, if you look at our just like history lah, over hundreds or thousands of years, the idea or concept of a nation state is fairly new. Malaysia has only been independent for about 60 years. Even the US probably, I don't know, like 200 years. Before that, we never had this idea of a country, of a nation state, right? You had like huge empires or civilizations, you had city-states, but no real concept of a nation state. So historically also, that idea of a nation state isn't that long. And with the advance of technology, you could imagine that a different kind of government or state could exist. And even if you ignore crypto or whatever, like, it looks like that is gradually happening regardless, right? Like, people are feeling less and less a part of the same kind of nation. And if you want to be very like pessimistic about it, you could say like, one path that it might lead to is conflict lah. This side wins, the other side not happy. That side wins, this other side not happy. And one way to resolve it is through conflict. But if there was a way to coordinate with each other, it could be done using either blockchain or similar technologies lah. So that's completely my personal opinion, but I think there is some tangent or parallel to what this network state is about. But anyway, we shouldn't put in people's opinions first. Anyone should share, but I think we should go through like some of the basic stuff first. Faiz, if you can go to the chapter, right, and scroll down to one. You scroll up. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Go to the menu. And there is like a one sentence. Yeah, you can go to the one sentence part first. Yeah, so the one sentence part here is actually a couple sentences he put here. Yeah, so we can go to the first one, the informal sentence. So network state is a highly aligned online community, capacity for collective action, crowd funds territory around the world, and then eventually it gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. So if you look at current environment now, there are already a lot of highly aligned online communities. Even if you don't talk about crypto, there's like huge subreddits, huge, Facebook groups, And then when we talk about capacity for collective action, it's not entirely true in this case. But if you look at how USDC can get dumped just because people lose kind of panic and there's a bank run and people lose faith, like that is actually a collective action, right? If you look at Wall Street bets, when there was this what was the stock again that really got played?
GameStop.
Yeah, GameStop. Yeah, so like even maybe 10 years ago, you can't imagine like just normal people like collectively doing something that affected such a huge public company and like kind of the financial professional traders out there. So we've seen evidence of collective action. Then this part here is stuff that we haven't seen yet, but what Balaji at least argues is possible because you can imagine a lot of rich people online, a lot of rich crypto bros have a lot of money and potentially they could crowdfund territory. That means buying shared plot of land together. We've already seen crowdfunding of at least an attempt to buy the constitution of the US government. There was crowdfunding of a couple other things. One of them was at least successful. I can't remember what it was. So you've seen like, and it's like in millions of dollars. It's not like it's like small change. So we've seen example of that. And you could imagine an example where people do it for a plot of land and then this is a bit more of a stretch, but you can imagine eventually people who get that plot of land, they can stay together and they could, if they are highly influential also, they can also eventually gain recognition from other countries. So if you go down here, he expands a little bit more. So a network state is a social network, so we mentioned that. There is a moral innovation. I think we can cover this a little bit later. Sense of national consciousness, recognized founder, capacity for collective action, in-person level of civility, integrated cryptocurrency, consensual government limited by social smart contract, and an archipelago of crowdfunded physical territories, virtual capital, on-chain consensus, income, real estate footprint. I think he covers a little bit more later. So, Faiz, if you can go to the next one. Just go down. Also can. Network state in one image. Yes, so network state in one image. So this is a different view, and I think a big part of his kind of book or his points is that you can imagine that there is a live dashboard, right, of various communities around the world. So let's say there's an ETH community, let's say there's an ETH Tokyo or ETH Mumbai, and there are people in these communities from around the world. You can have dashboards because you can track it. It's essentially like how you track blockchain nodes, right? So you can track how many people there are, how much income they are getting if it's entirely on chain, and how many square meters of land that they have bought. So like it's land that's bought around the world, not just in one place. So this is just describing that same point in a picture instead of one sentence. And you can see that the first thing is it's not physically centralized. So like you would potentially have plots of land in different parts of the world geographically. And then because of this whole online thing, right, and a dashboard, so you could imagine it comes from anyone could start a country. In this case, kind of like how when we had ICOs, people say you can start your own company, which maybe is a simplification, but it is true. You can start it just from a laptop. So you potentially could start something like this just from a laptop as well. And one cool thing with the dashboard is that you have a real-time census. So I don't know how many of you like kind of look at how governments do census, how they find out about their population. It's very like cumbersome and it's not necessarily accurate. It's essentially surveys and polls. But if you have these kinds of community who are connected online, you can do real-time census, which a normal government or country would find it very, very hard to do, given that there's a lot of technical debt that they would have to overcome to be able to do this. Yeah, so you can also do things where in a continuous way. You know, you don't have to do things like, let's say, every 4 years. You can have things that are much more fluid. And it's much more easier to get people to move in and out of a so-called country lah. You know, immigrants, because it's online, you know, it's easier for them to immigrate into a particular community versus others. Can you go next? Yeah. Okay, so network state in 1,000 words. So here actually he goes through some of the points that he mentions in a bit more detail, or like the steps that in his mind at least is what you need to take to get to a network state. And interestingly, you can see some similarities with ETHKL, at least at the first few steps here, and many online communities around the world. So the first step he says is you could found a startup society. So basically just an online community that there is a shared alignment of a goal. So a crypto community is a good kind of example. So you all have a shared, like the simplest numbers version would be like, let's say you all believe in this coin, right? So you all come together online because you all want to pump that coin together. You could also have a group, like, let's say like ETHKL, who have a shared vision of how you want to use blockchains and smart contracts to better the world. But there is an alignment of aspiration that people come together. And then you could, after you have that society, you could organize it to do collective action, to be able to do something together. He describes it as a network union where unlike a normal union, it's not like protesting or challenging a particular company, but it can be used. If you can imagine a union, right? You can get together to do a bunch of different things out there. And then after you've done those first two steps online, then you do things offline. So you could do in-person meetups like what we're having now, and like, because there's only so much that you can do online. When you do things offline, then you build like a certain level of trust that you won't be able to do online. And I think this is the part where it gets a bit more like into the physical world. So step number 4 is crowdfund physical nodes. So once there is an element of community between the different people, then you can start crowdfunding, let's say small houses or hacker houses, apartments, and then gradually to like bigger spaces like towns and even cities after that. And the cool thing with this is you don't have to do it in one place, right? You can do it in many different places. So you could have physical communities from around the world, and like you have, like, let's say one in KL, one in the UK, or one in Japan. And then because a member is a member of this online community, they could even, like, when they are moving across cities or different places, they can go to the other, let's say in Japan, they can go to where that plot of land is of that same community and still be able to access the same facilities or benefits. He mentioned this earlier, but yeah. So step number 6, you can conduct on-chain census. So you can do, you can get data such as population, income, and so on, and you can show it in real time to, like, kind of, let's say if you have like a total balance of funds that are held by the members, you can show it online. And with that comes influence, and so you could then convince other states around the world to be able to recognize you as a country. Again, just to recap, this is a theory from Balaji. It may not necessarily end up this way, or it may not actually be practical, but this is, in summary, what he's saying. If you can go to the next one. I think this one, yeah, never said what I say. We'll just go through this first, and I think we can discuss, because that essentially summarizes the point of the book, without going into like details like the culture war. But yeah, so this part here, if you scroll down a little bit, he just describes like how typically in human history people have founded countries. So the first one is the most like relevant one for people. You win an election, and then you either like write new laws, or you like go and secede and create your own country out of an existing one. Then the next two are not so nice. Either you revolt and overthrow a government, or there is a war or some sort of huge conflict where people die, and then you create a new government from that. Then the more controversial ones, or more fantastical ones. So the idea of a micronation is like, for example, if you can get a plot of land or an offshore platform that's like in the sea, then you can essentially stake ownership over that place if no one else is claiming ownership of it. And similar to that is seasteading. I don't know if anyone's heard of seasteading. If you know what seasteading is, essentially, if you have like a huge cruise ship, right, you could live on that cruise ship for 365 days a year, and essentially that's your country lah. So that's I think this Patrick Friedman, I think ex Google person and descendant of the Milton Friedman, popular from economics, is a huge founder who's doing this. And lastly is just do it in space. If you do it in Mars or the Moon, like no one can say that that land belongs to them. So you can get there first and start a community there. And then finally, number 7 is Balaji's contribution of what's called a network state. So you start online, unlike all the others, and then you eventually get more plots of land in other places. So that's a kind of a quick summary. Anyone got anything that you want to add based on what you've read or understood from Balaji's thing, so that we're aware of that? Okay, if not, it's fine. Just as a reminder, this is not meant to be a talk by me. So it's really a discussion for anyone who wants to have it. But yeah, if we go to Google Docs, so we covered the first few parts. So I thought some other things we could do is just to give thoughts on what we've had about network state or about similar concepts, and I can start with a couple main ones that I have. I probably have more, but I haven't sat down to literally write them down. And when we're discussing it, I probably can remember what I've thought about. But the first obvious one to me is how do you avoid conflict? It's very easy to say these kinds of words, to throw out a theory. But when you want to do this, if I'm the Malaysian government or I'm the Russian government or the US government, if you want to start buying plots of land and I can see that you are, doing this to eventually form a country, that is a threat to my sovereignty, and it is within my rights to take action against you, whether financial or moral or physical. So I don't know how anyone would be able to do this without inviting conflict on them. And conversely, if you want to kind of prevent that, then you would kind of want to take up arms or have weapons or things that you can use. But if you do that, then you are getting very close to the 2 points that he mentioned of creating a government via conflict, via war or revolution. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on this. I feel I don't see how you can avoid from getting into this kind of situation. So I don't know how you can do this without confronting her.
I think in Honduras, some people who is affiliated with seasteading has already been doing this for maybe more than a decade. They actually managed to somehow lobby the government of Honduras to change their constitution, to create a special economic zone that allows them independence of judiciary and independence of what is it? I can't remember. Like security for you can actually, as a private company, have your own security forces when you're in that part of Honduras. Yeah, it's called ZED. Like, I mean, it's short for.
What's it called?
It's an acronym.
How do you spell it?
ZEDE.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. That's cool.
Yeah, and it's not uncontroversial either because obviously the locals feel like wow, like like there's a lot of like companies like who would come in there and set up their own system.
So you bring economy
Right.
contribution up.
Yeah, but just like the locals there actually don't benefit a lot, and so they have been protesting in the
Okay.
past as well. But I don't know, it's still going on.
Okay. Well, I mean, the fact that they made it like 2 decades, I think that's quite a
Yeah.
huge achievement.
Mm-hmm.
Just gonna tap this here. Yeah, I think that maybe is one example of how it works. Another thought similar to this is like I don't know if I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but so one idea, right, is that you could maybe not have a network state, but a network community that is still part of a state, right? So instead of like creating something that competes with your local physical government, you could do something that is maybe more like I don't know what the term is, like some sort of club where the members are joining and they're all still citizens of whatever country, but it's you have kind of like set up some sort of filter anyone who wants to like be part of that community. I can see what you've done online, I can see that you share a same kind of vision, then you can be part of this community, but you're not trying to be a different, to hold citizenship of a different country lah. I think that's not exactly network state, but there is some similarity with the idea. So you kind of do it in a way where you're not trying to compete with the government lah. Whether or not that makes it, because I mean there's the miracle of Wargirl thing where just a quick background, like there was after the late 1920s or early 1930s economic depression in Austria, in a city they created a currency which worked really well because there is this like demurrage, or like the currency you're forced to spend it, otherwise there's no use, and it worked really well, but then the central bank shut it down. So I think the counterpoint to my example is that government, because they might feel threatened anyway, even if you don't want to compete with them, then they can shut you down regardless. So then that would kind of defeat the whole point in the first place. Okay, cool. The next point I had was on this maintaining culture. So we mentioned a little bit, I think, off screen before we started recording, on how like a big part of the book covers this whole culture war that's happening in the US. Just a quick recap, I guess, like, there is the left that is going further extreme towards the left, and there is a right that is going further extreme towards the right, and anything that anyone does from either side, or even people in the center, would get labeled or flagged to be on the other side. And there's less and less like logical or shared kind of thinking, and if you imagine that happening across different people around the world in different geographical locations, I can't help but feel like there would be even more of that would kind of start up. Maybe at first you have a shared aspiration on let's say Ethereum, or let's say ReFi. There's a shared goal, but as you kind of run a country, eventually there will be like different interests, different goals, different desires of the different members. Then ultimately they would then also have their own kind of differences in culture, right? So how do you, as a network state, how do you deal with that? Like, do you fork your country every time? How do you do it without having some sort of conflict? Yeah, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that part.
Where to start?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of questions in there, right? The first question is like inside any group, whether you're a state or a online community, how do you kind of like maintain like consensus? right? And of course, at one extreme, like you can be a dictator, you can force everybody to agree on something, right? Like most likely people who have means of exit will exit. On the other hand, you can be totally free, right? And then people will choose based on that, and it's quality of ideas that win. But then at one extreme, you can kind of end up forking 100 different ways. And I think one of the challenge, I guess ultimately the logic of what I think Balaji is going for is that if people are to stay together, there should be more rationale for them. They should get more out of being together than being apart. Or it's the same why do people have families or form communities and villages? Is because yes, you don't agree with everybody 100%, but you gain more out of being together than being apart. And of course, the trade-offs balance. These days, a lot more people are divorce rates are higher today than maybe 50 years ago. Part of that, there's a lot of people saying it's a morality thing. Part of it is also kind of a logistical thing, right? 50, 100 years ago, if you had to manage your farm and grow and manage a small piece of your house, right? That was very unfeasible to do if you weren't a couple or a family, right? That's also why people had big families, because every kid was a laborer in a way, right? But in the modern context, many people, many cities support people living single perfectly fine, right? There's a lot of social kinds of stuff, norms around being single are also a lot more acceptable. So in a way, it enables the cost of being not together in a different way. And if you scale it up to a community or all that, right? So I don't think Balaji is advocating a single super network state around the world, but he's saying a world in which and I think the culture war thing is significant because a lot of the view in the US now is that if I go one way, everybody is on the left and you go towards this thing where your police for whatever you say. On the other hand, you go to the right where it's basically kind of rule of the strongest and it's all fighting. And it's just if you actually think about, hey, I want a world where I can be free to think what I want and do something and still have benefits from society, right? Both of these options kind of suck, right? And I think he's putting up networks there and saying, hey, that's not the only way where you can actually have governments that create conditions under which people might want to live, right? So I guess every government has to do that trade-off, but I think his point is that there's not a perfect way to do it, but that's why you need to make it easy to form a new state or government, because then states can compete to be better governed, right? And if people can compete, then people have a higher chance of getting a formula that actually is attractive and sustainable and can get the right people.
Yeah, and there's one thing I've also thought a lot about is and it's a good thing that nation states exist with passports and borders and stuff. We have a lot more certainty. If you imagine people from hundreds of years ago, you might be traveling somewhere in a caravan and you get raided and you get killed or raped or whatever. But one downside with the borders that we have is that you have this passport, right? And let's say you are part of a country and you may not enjoy or you may not share the same beliefs, same culture of the people there, and you want to move out. It's a lot more difficult now because you need to get a visa, you need to get apply and all that stuff. Whereas people from before, if they don't they can just take their belongings and move somewhere else, right? So I don't know how much of a similarity there are, but the idea of having this network community is potentially it's easier for you to move to a different network state, even though it's essentially next door potentially, but physically, but online, and when it comes to shared interests and goals and beliefs, you could move very quickly between different ones. Yeah, so I think that's a good point. I still feel especially when it comes to country level stuff, right? There will be resources that have been built up, finances, financial capital or social capital. Maybe this is just my understanding of humans, but you will build a certain political kind of influence. So even if at the point where there are some differences and you want to fork into different states, there will still be an interest in being the original one, right? Being the Ethereum versus the Ethereum Classic, because then you retain the that huge amount of capital, and I don't know if he discusses that. To be honest, I haven't read the
Yeah.
whole book, so I don't know if he discusses how people can handle that in a conflict minimized way.
Right. I think he does speak a bit about that, but like it's we don't need to go down the rabbit hole now. Yeah. But I think along the earlier point, right, which is like a lot of his pushing for the network state is really about how do you enable like competition on governance, right? And like as a different typology, and if you look through history, like the OG or the classic is not always the choice, right? The US is in a way like he talks a bit about this in the book, right? You think about like he cites a few examples of like interesting countries. Like I think he cites the US, Singapore, Israel, and is it India or something like that, or as different examples. And he says that if you look at their their constitutions and their laws, right? They actually like you think of law as code, right? They all forks off the same code base, which is like they kind of come out of like UK, like what is now UK, like previously English, like common law, right? And so like and you know each of them had a reason that they evolve a certain way. Right, and the respective code bases plus the cultural factors plus all these other things have enabled the societies to grow and to flourish in different ways, right? And you know, like at the time when the US became independent, it was this bunch of like random colonies on this other side of the world that were pretty like kind of like useless, right? Like they were minority people in the continent, like I think where the population was majority like what we now call Native American. Right, but over time, you know, like you fast forward 200 years, right? Especially after World War II, now most people say, oh, like the US is actually a much better deal than that, right? So like things can happen over time, and sometimes even like a lot of money now is actually isn't really held by nations anymore, right? Like you think about it, like a lot of corporations have more wealth, their own private security forces. If you go to like my bet is if you go to Brunei, the Shell facilities is probably better protected than maybe the palace, right? Like, cause like they have like different security forces. Like a lot of countries now have like offshore special economic zones and stuff like that. So even if you don't think about network states, right? States are not completely all the same. There's special zones of all sorts, right? Like you know, like there's a lot of like gray areas, right? Like there's special zones where like there's no taxes. Like there's zones in like I think Switzerland where you can like put in art that is not in any country because then you have to pay a tax on the value of the art and you can just hold it there in some sort of weird thing. So there's already a lot of hacks in the international law system, right? So in some ways like there's a lot of pockets where like there's already precedents that exist even before you bring in the network stuff, state stuff, and I think ultimately, like in international relations, I mean, like the saying is kind of like what, like there's a very realist, pessimist view, which is like the strong do what they want, the weak do what they must, right? And I think in like kind of like the answer towards like how do you avoid conflict with others, is that how have small states like Singapore and others survived until now, and you know like by being more useful to other people to exist than to not exist or to be co-opted, right? And like maybe it's a combination of diplomacy and like being useful and like I'm sure at some points leverage or power in some ways is also critical, but on some level you can't avoid that. But if you look at the population of like a network, what a network state population is likely to have, you have pretty smart people with global influence and capability and stuff like that. Like you know like I mean they could like they're probably capable of defending themselves in some ways, right? Maybe not directly with like guns and pistols and stuff like that, but you know, like I mean, any kind of organization, any kind of community that has something worth stealing, right? Generally, once you think about like how is your stuff going to be protected, and it may not be like direct security, but you know, like what sort of leverage do you have to protect that?
And I think a very interesting point to that is like again maybe not physical weaponry, but if you have like financial weaponry, right? And we can look at you know basically all the hacks in smart contracts that have existed. That could also be a way to kind of counter lah. You know, you attack us, we will attack you.
If you steal this money, the money disappears right away, right? Or like self-destructing. There's a lot of different kinds of things you can build in with code that might be as effective deterrents. For that. Of course, land is you know kind of like generally have to defend land like
run away.
Physically, right? Like and all that. But even then, there's a lot of different ways to like that people have thought about defending and acquiring land.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting ways I think as a smaller country or smaller entity, is you can do this like mutually assured destruction thing, right? So you can create an
Right.
environment where you can have some sort of maybe not physical weapons, but again like maybe financial weapons or things like that, where like if you attack me, then I will bring you down with me,
Yeah.
and you have enough of a credible threat that it becomes like a
Yeah.
self-defense thing lah. Yeah.
But I think without even being so weak, like there's also like kind of like there's this conflict realist sort of international relations view, but there's also a symbiotic kind of view, right? Like if you are a neighbor, if Malaysia has a lot of land, like so like you have part of like let's say like what's the biggest state, Sarawak, right? You have part of the land, and suddenly there's a new group of people that come out there that are super smart, super wealthy, and all that, right? Like it may not be so smart for Malaysia, even we may not like them very much, but it may be smarter for us to think about how do we trade and like find a good neighbor partnership with them than attacking.
Yeah.
Right, like conquest is not the only way to benefit from a wealthy neighbor, right? You can think about other relationships and stuff as well, and so in some ways, like it is part of like what some places like Hong Kong has been able to do, because obviously there was some geopolitics in there as well. But if you're more useful to your neighbors, like alive than dead,
Yeah.
then that also gives you some
And
stuff.
I guess very close to home is just Singapore lah, right? Like,
Yeah.
when
Or
they
Switzerland, right? Like in the middle of
Yeah.
all the world
Big
wars
countries.
on the island. Of course, being in the mountains helps. So there's some natural
Yeah.
defenses and stuff like that. But I think all the sides in the war wanted Switzerland intact because all their wealth was in there, right? Like if you were whether it was the Nazis stealing stuff from like from like old monasteries and like sticking it there, or like the other side, like there was some mutual interest in keeping that alive. And I'm not saying that all networks have to go down that path necessarily. Right, but on some level, like if you are in the real game, which is no one is obligated to defend you, then like you get what you negotiate, and that's
quick pause just to get from
Yeah.
your thoughts, if you have any thoughts at all. Like, does it make sense? Is it completely? Are you completely lost?
Brand new concept.
yeah.
Yeah.
But does it make sense to you? The whole story, the whole arguments.
Yeah, you can see our world is moving on that part. Even like DAO, so we are using the blockchain technology to make organization decentralized. So
Yeah, I think ultimately, like,
I'm curious. What about you?
Faiz, if you have any thoughts.
I mean, these things, it may seem new because of the blockchain stuff, right? But I think it's been there for a while now. So it's like the way we have like a right-minded, the right idea, just bring up together, right? Combine together, and it's pretty much the same thing like how we have in the state. It's just that we can realize it more because of the blockchain technology. It's just something that is not new, but it's always there. It's just like the way the form probably different.
Yep.
So I was going to say also, like we mentioned at the start, like it feels, at least to me, that it's inevitable that we are heading down a path where people will go away from wanting to be part of the same nation state anyway, and without some sort of solution like this, you can't avoid from thinking it will end up in some sort of conflict. So at least this is a path forward that people can try. Hopefully people in the current generation or the next generation to try before the kind of culture war things reach a breaking point, and we end up in some form of conflict. So maybe there's like a way forward that people can try. Okay, so any other points?
I just wanted to add on to something Faiz is talking about. So I feel like Faiz was saying that the ideas here are actually not new. There are Bit Nation, which I have some friends in, had explored this a long time ago. But also, between them, the founders, there was also some kind of fork of on the issue of violence, actually, on the issue of whether to use gun or not. And that's interesting because it's really at the core of what needs to be resolved for anything that small actors for me, I guess I see it as there's hard power and there's soft power. and you can provide a lot of soft power benefit. And sometimes when it comes to hard power, like if you don't have a strategy, it will, like, for, how do I put it, like, this is I have a friend, Daniel Schwantenberger. He is actually looking into Web3, because he thought, like, the example of Switzerland, I don't know if it's Switzerland or not, but he mentioned a country that has their military budget transparently, like, disclosed to the citizen. And so, like, he felt like that was interesting, because if you had done that in a typical world, you would think that you would get attacked because people know exactly what your military inventory and everything is. But somehow the reverse happened, and so for him, he started looking into smart contracts as a way to get, like, small countries to kind of, like, band up together, so that, like, like you said, a mutually assured destruction, like, it actually has this effect of creating some kind of, like, positive cooperative game theory that can kind of keep the big actor in check. So that's what he is interested in right now, and he's actually actively lobbying, like, crazy enough, like, nation state, like, leader to, like, adopt this. Like, he wants it to be, like, on the blockchain, like, he wants, like,
Public.
yeah. So yeah, and then this is my own personal plug. I actually wrote a paper on code as law before,
Oh, really?
during the DAO hack back then. And again, this goes into a lot of question around governance, like, because like, I mean, Ethereum has Vitalik as a benevolent dictator, but not every nation state like, would even voluntarily elect for that, right?
Yeah.
So how
There's actually a good point, since you mentioned benevolent leader. Somewhere, I can't figure out where exactly in that book, Balaji makes a strong point, in his opinion, of there needing to be a founder. A strong founder. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I haven't read too much of what he said.
I think his point was that, like, it's because ultimately, like, communities, like a strong enough community to form this, like, typically needs, like, a strong, like, what he calls a moral innovation, where it's kind of some sort of, like, story or purpose and all that, like, oh, like, we are people who don't believe in guns, or some sort of thing, and, like, I mean, it can be more specific than that, right? But some sort of, like, great story, and usually, like, typically, like there's a lot for, like, human leadership and entrepreneurship to kind of bring it about, right? Of course, like, that someone who starts it may not need to, like, you can also envision a society that eventually is self-governing and doesn't need, like, a strong personal leader. But I think he was kind of saying empirically, to start something, very often, like, what can start without, like, having at least someone disproportionately invest a lot of time and energy and into, like, studying it, right? So I think that's kind of what the idea of a founder is. But obviously, if something's self-found, like, maybe, but like.
I'm interested to see, because, like, Vitalik is very young, right?
Yeah.
Interested to see if these network or online communities can have a strong founder that builds things up, but is kind of selfless enough or decentralized enough to, like, give up their power. Because at least from my observation, like, there are a lot of leaders who, whether or not they are like royalties,
power corrupts, right?
And then it becomes their kids or their, like, close family who essentially, like, inherit. I guess there might be exceptions, but even if you look at, like, let's say Malaysia and Singapore, you can see it's, like, kind of same families, right? Even if a new leader comes up, then by the next generation it's their kids, whether it's Malaysia or Singapore. So I don't know how that translates in an online.
I don't think I can do this particular question justice by itself, but, like, I will say that this is not a new problem. This is a pretty old problem that's been studied extensively in political science, right? So, like, people like John Rawls this idea of the wheel of ignorance, where, like, kind of like the idea of the wheel. If you all heard of the wheel of ignorance, John Rawls, Rawls, right? Basically, the idea of wheel of ignorance is that you should choose a society to live in based on this idea that, let's say you wear this wheel, you're blinded, right? I'm going to join this society, but I don't know whether I'll join in the top 1% or the middle 50% at the bottom, right? And the idea is that the ideal society is one that no matter which person in the society I am, I would still want to join the society, right? And so it kind of creates a society where, like, it's not because of who you know and all that. So, like, the accident of, like, whether I'm born into society, whether I was lucky to be born into, like, a rich family or poor family or, like, a certain race or not, right? But so that's his idea of the ideal society, and like I think part of the potential moral innovations that Balaji is talking about could actually be like we could sort of smart contract and design some of these things into being, right? To have a self-expiring like benevolent dictator thing where after five years I must kind of like hand over to somebody, or like the smart contracts will transfer power automatically to a randomized person and stuff like that, right? That could be.
There's a term for it, right? Where like a random person is elected as leader. I feel like
there's a term for that, right? So like and is that the right? Obviously like you can debate what that is, right? But I think one of the power of the blockchain now is that you can actually make these codes as self-executing, whereas a lot of democracies today, right, have codes that have term limits and stuff like that, right? But typically, if the leader is powerful enough, they just amend the code, right? Like we've seen some big leaders, I won't name names, right, who have extended and overridden their term limits multiple times, and there may be good reasons for them doing so, right? But the problem with like laws versus code is that laws are typically easier to change if you have a stranglehold on power. Whereas like if you design a good balance, like a trustless system, then like it can be self-executing, so it's easier to prove that commitment.
Okay, so we have 8 minutes before 9:30. I did want to put in there, if anyone's interested, to kind of discuss it from a Malaysian, because this whole thing is global, online. You get written from someone who is from India but lives in the US. Like if there's any takes as a Malaysian, we have our own upbringing, we have our own views of the world. Like if anyone has any points of view on this topic as a Malaysian.
I'm thinking.
I'm just throwing it out there. I think there's a lot to absorb, a lot to.
I have a few ideas. One is that we spoke a bit about kind of like if you talk about Malaysia today, I probably have more in common with the Reddit groups or the things that I'm part of with other people than with like 10 random Malaysians in the same city, right? And so in some ways, like Malaysia is a good example of this, where like despite like 5-6 decades of nation building now, right? It feels like a lot of older people will complain that growing up in Malaysia today is actually quite different from growing up like 30 years ago. Right, you're more ready to be like in like gated communities or separate things. Like people have less like multiracial friends, and of course we can get to the whole historical reasoning for that. But in some way, like we're in a case where culturally, like a lot of people have more like interesting affinities online than offline. I think this is true for actually many Malaysians. And if you look at the recent elections, right, we are seeing also there's actually different groups in Malaysia that are asserting in different ways, and I think it was eye-opening for many people as well.
And well, maybe not the same point, but you mentioned like the whole like in previous times in kampongs, people were a lot more like diverse culturally and open to sharing with each other, and I think that's something that. It's not even related to crypto lah, right? This whole point about how like why is it that when you were in kampongs you were much more open, much more sharing versus in cities? There's the obvious take of like in city you're working full time, you don't rely on your neighbors to like watch over your kids or things like that. So that I think naturally creates a form of division. But I don't know. It does feel like speaking as a Malaysian living in KL, like. When you have these kinds of things online, right? Let's say you have subreddits, you have like these communities that you can be a part of online, and you can build that kind of connection with people better, right? So like even in KL, where there might be like 8 million people, but KL is an example, right? People who have a shared interest of Web3 or blockchain, and you can get together and potentially let's say get a hacker house and stay together, right? So there's already that kind of direction or some sort of like momentum to do something that is a bit more kampong-like in the closeness of feeling. So
I think maybe like part of the trick is embracing that instead of like shunning that, right? I think like online friends aren't bad and offline friends are good, right? But it's actually like if online solves certain problems better, right? How do you encourage that? And can you have like good online that actually foster whether it's a Malaysian spirit or like a kampong spirit that is healthier, and how can
living gotong royong spirit.
Yeah,
Like,
perhaps,
Yeah. Well, I guess then it's up to the people in that kampung, right? Because like you could have a spirit of pumping and dumping, or you could also have a spirit of people who want to like
Right.
do a shared good for the world.
yeah, I guess this is where the part of my brain goes into again, like maybe hard power versus soft power. Like, okay, so I think like somehow like the beauty in Malaysia, which is actually like diversity, is something that is it's just not how do I put it? In the current financial system, it's not valued. It's something that I really wish that in Malaysia that we appreciate this much more. Like, okay, I think that like resiliency comes from diversity, and like you can actually map it out in graph. Like the ones that have most resilient is just the most diverse nodes. But however, like I think that the financial system that we have designed today, unfortunately, is something that keeps us all like how to individualize, and so the coming together is not something that is valued. So that's why I'm interested in things like regenerative finance. But that's because in order for something regenerative to come about, you have to find a way to value the coming together and coordination. It's like solving coordination problems, and yeah, it's like yeah. One day I really hope that we can value people who are like typically seen as weak or kind or something, that actually enjoys more power than people who are just using brute force. But that involves an inversion of the current paradigm that we're in, because it means something like, well, the person who is, let's say, in my term of most environmentally friendly, it's like a weak action, right? Like you don't get money from being environmentally conscious, but that's the current financial system we're in. So now I'm like, well, is there some kind of gotong royong coin, not or credit or something that we can, kickstart? Yeah.
And do it in such a way where we don't corrupt this person who was like originally kind and helpful,
Yeah, that's true.
and they're powerful, they get corrupted.
Maybe they are randomly awarded.
The whole idea of being random
Perhaps,
people to be leader lah. Okay, I think if we have any last thoughts from anyone?
Malaysia has 13 plus territories in terms of states.
Yeah.
Right. I think we have actually a bit of a mini lab that shows kind of the potential of state systems, right?
You say mini labs?
Mini lab. I mean, Malaysia's kind of a laboratory of different kinds of states, right? I've looked at we have some of the states have different state governments, and you can see different kinds of ways that they are being managed, and you're seeing people also work with their feet and stuff like that, right? So I think in some ways the places that have multiple states already, right, maybe are more interesting places to actually prototype some of these network state ideas. You don't have to buy out the land and get your own army and all that necessarily, but you say, hey, state with too much land, Pahang has a lot of land. If you had some towns, and in fact many places are trying to do this. Right, a lot of places are trying to say I'm going to create this district that I'm going to attract a lot of digital nomads to come in.
Yeah, and essentially a lot of the big tech companies out there have done that, right? When they, Apple sets up a campus or Microsoft sets up a campus outside of Seattle City, and people move there.
Right, exactly. And so in some ways states and cities also has incentive to attract people to come, right? And maybe network state is just an amplified version of that, but instead of saying, hey, Penang will build this corner and you can all come, right? But if you give this corner maybe ZD type of rights and stuff like that, maybe you can attract even more people and even more activity. Of course, there's always a dilemma of how do you do it in a way where the locals feel they benefit instead of just the mayor benefits and stuff like that. But I mean, that's not a new problem in Malaysia. We have a lot of cases where partnerships are formed with other companies or countries, right? And sometimes you see that only a few leaders benefit, and the rest of the people next to it actually end up losing out.
Always the case.
Yeah.
I want to shield this. I DM you on Telegram. I want to shield this a mini game on game theory. I don't know
awesome.
if you guys have seen this.
Yeah.
You know this already? Yeah. So if you guys want to play,
I highly recommend it as well. Yeah.
Actually, it's there lah. Don't need to check DM. It's not really a game lah. You can play around with it, but it's kind of showing how
simulation or model.
Yeah, essentially describing game theory and how people can coordinate. and the
Yeah,
different
right.
strategies of whether you want to betray someone or you want to coordinate someone. I don't know, it's not really directly relevant to this stuff, but it feels like there's a lot of if you want to encourage that, you know, people who are doing good for the community as a whole. Yeah, this game's a pretty interesting thing. Just to kind of like wrap your head around what kind of behavior leads to what kind of communities or societies. Yeah.
Yeah, still loading. I
Oh,
guess
yeah.
I have one comment about this. Like one of the main most interesting things about it is that you think about like trust and people like that. Sometimes it's easy to get very like depressed, right? Because you're like, oh, like, you know, one bad actor can like just
Destroy.
screw everybody over, right? But the point of this exercise and stuff like that, and like some of the game theory research into things like this, is that the threshold, if you design the game well, you can actually create like situations in which like the line, you don't have to get 100 good people of 100 for something good to happen. Like if you design a game well, like even 30 out of 100 is enough, right? And this is part of like how, like, you know, like I think like things like what a lot of like good like system design and like blockchain, like Bitcoin and Ethereum are doing, where you have enough mechanisms in place that like
The cost of attack. Yeah.
yeah, you can actually incentivize enough people to like, so like to get a, you don't have to make everybody a good person to have a society that's successful, right? So with some good game design, you can actually get away with like, you know, like a certain percentage of people that you consider good much of the time.
Yeah, it's unfortunately not loading at all. We're at 2% in the last 5 minutes, and we don't have much time.
Yeah.
But maybe we can figure out some sort of meetup activity around this game. I feel like it's a really cool, non-technical.
Actually, we should do like
thing to discuss.
there's a lot of games around like this kinds of stuff. We could do like a
Yeah, I
game
would love that.
day with like trust games, both
Yeah.
online and offline as well. That could be kind of fun.
That could be a
Like,
cool
like
activity to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're already 9:32. I don't want to keep people back. For people to go back, or you know, just hang out with people in the other rooms. We can all go downstairs. There's like food and teh tarik. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.